Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us tonight for our 2020 Rebele Symposium. My name is Janine Zakaria. I am the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer in the Department of Communication. I'm going to be the moderator this evening. And I'd like to first say a special thank you to our honored guests, Pat and Roland Rebele, the sponsors of tonight's evening, and to everyone in the Department of Communication who helped make tonight possible. In particular, our chair, Professor Jay Hamilton, and the person who makes so much happen for us around here, Mark Dezzutti, wherever you are. Thank you very much. We are gathered here a day after Super Tuesday to hear from four esteemed journalists who are on the front lines of this year's election. Why do we have these reporters here tonight? Well, in a nutshell, I think they're the most consequential. President Donald Trump owes his Electoral College victory, let's remember, to three states he won by the smallest number of votes: Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan, about 77,000 out of 136 million ballots cast. According to the final tallies, Trump won Pennsylvania by 0.7 percentage points, Wisconsin by 0.7, and Michigan by just 0.2 points, or 10,704 votes. Florida, he won by a whopping 1.2% of the vote. Obviously still a starkly divided state, but we all know the potential Florida has to be determinative. Only 537 votes divided President George W. Bush and Al Gore in 2000, so I couldn't imagine having a battleground state coverage panel without Florida. We're also gathered at a moment when we're experiencing a few troubling trends that are likely to impact this year's outcome, future outcomes, and perhaps the future of our democracy, unless I believe we figure out some solutions. So before we get into our discussion and before I introduce our panelists, let me just flick at the four trends which I hope can inform our talk tonight. Trend one, polarization, that surveys show has worsened over the past 4 years. Political polarization, the vast and growing gap between liberals and conservatives, Republicans and Democrats is, quote, a defining feature of American politics today. You don't need to be the Pew Research Center to note that, but that's who noted that. And our colleague in the Department of Communication, Shanto Iyengar, has demonstrated how whereas previously polarization was primarily seen on issue-based terms, now ordinary Americans are increasingly disliking and distrusting those from simply the other party. And it's a polarization that has led not only to a break in some of our relationships, maybe in our own families, but in our news consumption, making it so Americans, depending on their political predilections, are consuming completely different narratives about the same set of events. Quote, Republicans and Democrats place their trust in two nearly inverse news media environments, Pew noted in January, and they noted that it's getting worse. Which leads me to the second trend I wanted to flag tonight. The distrust of the media is increasing, especially among Republicans. Republicans' distrust of the media increased for 15 of 20 news sources that were asked about in 2019 compared to when they were asked about it 5 years prior, with notable growth in their distrust of CNN, the Washington Post, and the New York Times. Democrats' levels of trust in media changed considerably less. Put another way, and I was really struck by this, most adults in this country, including more than 9 in 10 Republicans, say they personally have lost trust in the news media, according to a study by the Knight Foundation. Unless we get too depressed at the start of the evening, 69% of those who said they lost trust, however, said that trust could be restored. And so one of the things that I and my colleagues here at Stanford are very focused on is figuring out how we're going to do that. And I wanted to hear specifically from these reporters their perspective on that. Now, there may be no term I loathe more than the media, a truly meaningless word, given how many different news outlets are out there that operate under various norms. But this growth in distrust of major, credible, fact-based media is what worries me the most. And I want to explore tonight just how much of this preceded President Trump's attacks on the press and how much he's simply exploiting it, something that was already there. Lest we forget, just as recently as this past Sunday, which was how long ago, 3 days ago, Trump tweeted in the middle of a spreading possible pandemic, quote, people are disgusted and embarrassed by the fake news media as headed by the New York Times, Washington Post, Comcast, and MSDNC, ABC, CBS News, and more. They no longer believe what they see and read, and for good reason. Fake news is indeed, all caps, the enemy of the people, exclamation point. Of course, this is a refrain that he's repeated over time, and several of our panelists have been covering some of President Trump's rallies and some of the other rallies of the other candidates, so I want to get at that. The third trend I want to talk about, and this one we were discussing just now, some of us over dinner, is a sharp decrease in the number of local reporters nationwide, which has contributed not only to more what are called news deserts, places where there isn't a single newspaper in the town or the county, for example, but also places that are vastly undercovered. The number of newsroom employees at U.S. newspapers declined by 47% between 2008 and 2018. I'm the Carlos Kelly McClatchy Lecturer. I work with my colleagues in McClatchy Hall. Last month, the McClatchy Company, which owns the Sacramento Bee, the Miami Herald, 30 newspapers in total, filed for bankruptcy. This drives home how important initiatives like the Rebele internship, which provides a generous stipend to Stanford students, some of whom are in the audience, to intern at news outlets across the country each summer. It fills some of this gap. Still, this contraction is a major problem that I want to explore tonight, especially how it contributes, perhaps, to these trends of increased distrust in the media. Simply put, most people, I don't think, and I want to hear again from the panelists, don't appreciate the important function that quality journalism plays in their daily lives. They don't meet journalists, okay, doing the work. The fourth and final trend I want to highlight is because of our dependence on our phones and our changing habits of how we consume information, a majority of Americans are getting at least some of their news on social media, a place rife with misinformation and disinformation that further confuses voters about not only what is true, but what is important. And to help us all unpack all of this and discuss how it looks from the states that could determine the next president, we have four outstanding journalists. To my left is Amy Hollyfield, the senior deputy editor of news for the Tampa Bay Times, where she's led reporters through 3 presidential elections and works as an editor as well for PolitiFact, which we'll talk a little bit tonight about fact checking. The Florida primary, FYI, is March 17th, just 2 weeks away. Emily Lawler, down at the end down there, is a Lansing-based political reporter and editor helping direct coverage of the election for MLLive.com, a leading digital source that feeds 8 newspapers across Michigan. We're especially grateful to have her because the Michigan primary is just 6 days away on March 10th, and they let her come, so I'm thrilled. Mika Solner is a political reporter for the Appleton Post-Crescent and the USA Today Network. She's also a contributor to PolitiFact, and of course Milwaukee will host what could be a contested Democratic National Convention this July. And finally, Julia Taruso is the Philadelphia Inquirer 2020 presidential election reporter. She just arrived from South Carolina, where she covered a highly impactful primary there. And who knows whether the April 28th primary will still be important. I'm guessing it will. So the way this is going to work is we're going to have a discussion up here about 45 minutes or so. First about maybe some of the politics of this and then getting into some of those media questions. And then we're going to start integrating the questions from the audience. There were cards available to you at the front. If you didn't get one, Mark Dezzutti or Katrine Wheeler, just raise your hand and they can bring them to you. They'll start collecting them and I'll integrate them as much as possible. So let's just start generally with, I think probably a lot of people still processing Super Tuesday, with just some quick sense, your main takeaways from tomorrow and how this may lead into your respective states. Who would like to start?
I guess
Emily,
I'm
go ahead.
The most topical. I think this going into Michigan next week really sets us up for a Biden or a Bernie Sanders decision of some sort. I think that obviously Elizabeth Warren's still making a big push. She'll be in Michigan next week. Tulsi Gabbard was in Michigan this week as well. But I think that Michigan really gets to be the next state that decides where the national narrative goes in terms of who can get this in the bag and who can get the most delegates.
Amy?
I'll just say, first of all, I was completely surprised by what's happened over the last 4 days. I think it's just been a tumultuous time that it's a lot to process. But we in Florida, we've been prepared to not matter at all in our primary. Now we're the biggest get into New York in April because there's 219 delegates at state in Florida in 2 weeks. And frankly, none of the candidates that are left have done anything in our state. They haven't been there. There's no groundwork. Bernie Sanders has a vast grassroots network of volunteers, but hasn't done events. So a lot's going to happen in the next 2 weeks. So I'm super excited for it. But also, I think the electorate is sort of like, taking a breath because the landscape has changed dramatically in just a few days.
So I was in South Carolina on primary day, and it was, sometimes you go to the polls and you talk to voters, and it's not a scientific study of the electorate. But I will say that I talked to so many African American voters in South Carolina who were unwavering in terms of Biden, and it was. Even given that, I was very surprised at how much he won by, the momentum he captured. And for us in Pennsylvania, our primary is later, but similarly, Biden is headquartered in Philadelphia, but there are no field offices yet. Mike Bloomberg has like 10 field offices. But it'll be interesting to see kind of the momentum pick up in terms of campaigning there. And the one other anecdote I'll share is I went to Oakland for Biden's brief pop-in at a diner on Super Tuesday, and the picture of the Bernie Sanders supporters with megaphones and signs, they weren't protesting Biden, they were just chanting pro-Sanders remarks, and then Biden going into this diner. I think that's kind of the primary in a nutshell. It was interesting.
Mika?
Yeah, I think the outcome definitely goes to show how unpredictable the election is going to be. If it does turn into kind of this horse race between Biden and Bernie Sanders, it's going to be a massive divide in the Democratic Party. And it's really going to determine who's going to show up to the polls, I think, as well, whether there's a progressive nominee or someone more moderate like Biden, and who can really take on Trump, because I definitely believe that Trump supporters are going to show up no matter what.
So Mika, let's start with Wisconsin. It was a real shock when Hillary Clinton lost that state, at least for her, and I think a lot of the pundits, a lot of hand-wringing that she didn't go there, that she took it for granted. Milwaukee saw a decline, I believe, of 41,000 voters between 2012 and 2016, and some were speculating that had to do with Wisconsin's new voter ID law, that may have made like 300,000 people didn't vote. Someone said, at least, not just someone, the Milwaukee elections chief. What's your take on what's going on with that voter ID issue and any other issues around, obstruction of voters in Wisconsin, or the ability of Democrats to win Wisconsin this time?
Sure. I think there's definitely a big push by Republicans to clean up the voter rolls. We're seeing a county judge in Wisconsin ordered 200,000 voters to be taken off the state rolls because of the possibility that they have moved or relocated. So voter suppression efforts and voting rights is going to be a huge topic this time around. In terms of driving turnout, we don't know how much that's going to impact, this time around.
And President Trump was just there, right, recently, even though he didn't do well in Milwaukee. Why did he have a rally there?
Yeah, Trump's re-election campaign is really trying to diversify its voting base by expanding into some of the Democratic areas of the state. They're trying to kind of reach the urban voters as well as maybe communities of color around Milwaukee and Madison to, take some of that momentum away from the Democratic and turn them to Trump as an alternative.
Let's stick with this whole issue of voter suppression, or maybe actually voter facilitation. Emily, in Michigan, they have for the first time no reason absentee. Is that right? Talk about that.
Yep. So we had a big ballot proposal in 2018 that passed, and it just expanded access to the ballot generally. You can do same-day registration in Michigan now. You can do no reason absentee. Before you had to meet a criteria to vote absentee. So we've actually seen a 71% increase so far in absentee ballots issued. We've issued more than 800,000 absentee ballots, and that's in a state of a little under 10 million people. So, and we actually, interesting dynamic, allow people to spoil their ballots if they change their mind or if their candidate drops out. So we're going to have people, we have had more than 8,000 people spoil their ballots and file new ones or plan to vote on election day. So our clerks are going to be very busy, and I hope that our results are in before Iowa's. I'm sure there will be.
It's going to be messy. Now in Florida, it seems like the opposite story. Amy, you want to talk about what's going on with the felons?
Yeah, so I don't know if you know, but Florida has been the outlier in terms of disenfranchisement of felons, just the most egregious policy toward it. In 2018, there was a ballot measure that 73% of Floridians supported to change the law and make it so anyone who had fulfilled their debt to society could regain the right to vote and some other rights. Well, the Republican-led legislature decided that that couldn't just happen, that they needed to step in and do an implementing law. And so they passed a law to define the terms of what it meant to repay your debt to society. And they included the court fees and fines that happen, in cases, which in some people's cases is millions of dollars. So since that legislation, there've been court cases. There was just, that was 2019. It's 2020. This is more than 1 million voters who could be coming to the voter rolls, and you can imagine these are the suggestion is these are Democratic voters, and this is an idea to suppress. But right now it's tied up in the courts. The Circuit Court of Appeals just ruled in favor of 17 felons who wanted to register to vote and said that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment to allow a policy that made it not possible for some people and possible for others, that it just wasn't fair, it wasn't equal. But that was only 17, and now the state of Florida is objecting to that. So it's not going to be settled for 2020. I don't know when it's going to be settled, and it's kind of outrageous when you think about the fact that 73% of Floridians said they wanted this to happen.
Wait, so to be clear, no former felons are going to be able to vote right now, or the ones with the fines, they still have the outstanding fines?
It's funny, the people who led the ballot measure have been pushing felons to just go ahead and register. And a bunch of people did right when it became law in 2019. There were local elections, so we covered that. We had a big mayoral race in the city of Tampa, and people voted, and it was a joyous thing. And now it's just a matter of those local supervisors of elections and how they're dealing with
their
it.
jurisdiction. They can decide.
Yeah, and there've been some states' attorneys have stepped in with funds to sort of like wipe out the costs of their people in their districts, or to a rocket docket with a judge to sort of wipe through stuff. But that's random. It's not the whole of the 1 million people.
Guys, so Robert Reich tweeted today, "I've said it before and I'll say it again. Bloomberg should have used the $559 million he wasted on campaign ads to pay off the fines and fees, now keeping hundreds of thousands of Floridians from the polls in 2020. Julia, what's going on in Pennsylvania? Anything we need to be aware of in terms of voter access?
Well, I'll just say briefly, I also think that a lot of formerly incarcerated people don't realize they can vote even in states where they can. I've interviewed many people who I go up to and I say, oh, what do you think of politics? And they say, oh, I can't vote. I have a record. And anyway,
interesting.
Pennsylvania, similar to Michigan, for the first time, we are going to have no reason absentee ballots, but it's a little different. You can't do it the same day. You have to do it 50 days before. And it's becoming clear that it's probably going to play out really differently depending on the county you're in. So I could not believe that in California you can drive through and put your ballot in a drive-through ballot drop-off. Shocked me. I took a video and tweeted it. But in most counties, you either have to mail it in or bring your ballot to the hub of the county. The state is trying to get these counties to increase places where people can drop off their ballots, increase staffing and hours to make it easier. And the various county election boards are saying, we don't have the staff for that, we don't have the money for that. So how accessible it is will depend on how wealthy the area you live in is. But there will be no reason absentee, and you can mail them in.
Emily, Amy was talking about the absence of the ground game for the Sanders campaign and the Biden campaign in Florida. Have you been seeing a similar phenomenon in Michigan, and how has President Trump perhaps been capitalizing on that?
Yeah, we've seen really Democratic candidates have not been in Michigan in the last couple months, and that's given Trump and Pence a very big runway. They have a very big base of support in Michigan. Obviously, Trump won the state by a narrow margin that you mentioned last time. Trump and Pence have both been going to some pretty key areas of our state. Probably we've had 6-ish stops in the last, since December.
6 times either Pence or Trump have been in Michigan since December?
Yeah, and that's stops too, though. So sometimes, Vice President Pence might hit three things at once. But yeah, they've both been back and forth ping-ponging our state, hitting some population centers, hitting some big areas on the east side of the state, on the west side of the state. And they've had a pretty clear runway. Michael Bloomberg was doing some events in Michigan, and this week we'll see an influx. There's an influx of announced events because of our primary coming up. But I think that Democrats have kind of missed a little bit of a messaging opportunity so far in Michigan, and I'm sure they have plenty of time to make that up before a general election.
It's at least 6 in Pennsylvania as well.
They're also going there while the Democrats are not there.
Trump is in Scranton tomorrow. Pence and Trump have been there more than any Democrat so
You said
far.
something like you thought that Trump was trolling Biden.
Oh, he admitted
Scranton?
it. He kind
By
of
going to Scranton?
I mean, it's politically smart. He's
Yeah.
where there's a primary. He was in Charleston before the South Carolina
Right.
primary. He and I think he himself used the word trolling. I could be wrong, but
When you talk to voters, I mean, when you guys are all out there, talking to voters, maybe voters who perhaps voted for Obama and then they voted for Trump, and I mean, do you get any sense that they're willing to vote now for a Democrat, or are they really all in with Trump, whether or not, his policies have helped them or hurt them? How are they processing all this? Is it too early to say, or any sense of that?
I can say that I think that, there are some people who are more independent in the way that they view politics right now. I think what people are fed up with is the polarization of everything. They're tired of the horse race. They're tired of the way, a lot of the national news outlets kind of cover these races to really make it just this huge battle between, Trump country and the rest of the country. And they just want to, have the issues that they're dealing with every day to be solved. That's everything from having good health care, having a stable job, and being able to support their family. So I think there's a chance with some, but for those who are really ingrained into their own personal politics, it might be a little bit more slim of a chance.
I think in Pennsylvania, so in a lot of the more, I use rural generously, these aren't all farmland areas, but in a lot of the more rural counties, they felt abandoned, and reasonably so. Democrats hadn't been in touch in a while. Hillary Clinton did not campaign there. And when I go and report there, first of all, the reasons people voted for Trump in 2016, and I'm talking about like Democrats in red areas and independents in red areas, sometimes it was as simple as, I didn't know until I got in there, and then I said, let's give this guy a try. And I get a mix, but I will say, and it might be Biden's hometown connections, he is the name that comes up when the most in terms of the Obama-Trump voter.
Meaning they'd be willing to vote for Biden.
Right, but a lot of them, it's unclear. They're still pretty disenchanted with the whole process. To your point.
I was just going to say, Florida is a purple state. There's actually more Democrats in Florida than Republicans, even though the state's completely run by Republicans. And every election that we've had going back to 2000 has been decided by the smallest of percentages, usually less than 1%. So the fact that Trump won the state by 1.2%, that was kind of like, wow, that's like the biggest margin we've had, like of anything. Usually it's like a nail biter all night. So I mean, there hasn't been enough of a campaign in Florida. It hasn't. People haven't. Trump is there all the time, just like in all these other states. He lives there. I mean, he's there. His surrogates are there. Attorney General Barr was just there yesterday, and everybody comes and does something. But it's just going to be a matter of how it manifests itself, and frankly, who the nominee is. That'll make a big difference in Florida, because there's different tales. If it's Joe Biden, if it's Bernie Sanders, it'll be very different.
In Michigan, I really don't see anyone focusing on changing minds. I feel like people are focusing on turnout. I gave you our margin was 10,700 votes. That's also in Detroit. Wayne County is our county that Detroit is in. There were 37,000 fewer votes for Hillary Clinton than there were for Barack Obama the cycle before. So I think people are really focused on turning those segments out, and had some luck with that in 2018, especially in our suburbs. We saw 2 Democratic congresswomen elected that had been previously Republican seats. So our 2018 midterms kind of trended in that direction, and I think that Democrats are trying to keep that momentum going and drive turnout.
Emily, somebody I imagine we're going to start hearing from a lot more or about is Governor Whitmer. And today you had former Michigan Governor Jennifer Granholm endorsed Biden. You had former Senator Carl Levin endorse Biden. And now there's a lot of speculation about what she's going to do.
I am on pins and needles. She had previously indicated she wasn't planning on endorsing, but sort of left the door open. One of my colleagues asked her about the possibility of an endorsement today, and she said a lot has changed in the last 72 hours and to stay tuned. So I am certainly tuned in. You may have seen Governor Whitmer giving the response to the State of the Union recently. She's really raising her national profile. She was one of the first governors in the county or in the country to do the flavored vape ban that kind of put her on the national stage as well. So she's become kind of a kingmaker. When I talked with her a couple weeks ago, she said that virtually every major Democratic Party candidate had called her and asked for advice. I assume that when they're asking for advice, they're also asking for endorsements.
I want to shift now to election security. While we're sitting here, Senate Republicans are continuing to block election security bills, even as groups like Verified Voting warn of vulnerabilities in our vote tallying systems and our voters registration system, et cetera. And we, with our grad students here, our journalism grad students in 2018, reported on Pennsylvania. We looked at Pennsylvania's patchwork of voting system and found that most of Pennsylvania's counties, 50 out of 67 at the time, used machines with no paper trail, and that New Jersey, Delaware, 3 southern states relied entirely on these problematic machines. So there have been some changes since then, but I think it's still an issue that people are concerned about. Julia, could you speak about this? And then I want to especially come to Amy on Florida. Do you happen to know if anything's going on this issue right now?
Yeah, so everybody was required to change their voting machines so that there would be a paper trail. So those debuted in November. It was a very slow process getting all the results, which they say will be worked out by the Pennsylvania primary. And similar to the last thing I mentioned about different resourced counties and absentee ballots, originally there was some pushback from some counties that just said we can't afford to replace all our machines, but that there was a court ruling, and we are on pace we have now machines that have a paper trail in every county.
I'm going to take credit for that in our journalism program. Go, Cheryl. Now, Florida seems terrible. I'm terrified. The Tallahassee Democrat wrote last week, Florida's March 17th presidential primary will be a referendum on state and county elections officials' efforts to build a wall to stop hacking attempts that are constantly bombarding the system, end quote. To remind the audience, correct me if I'm wrong, Amy, 4 counties were hacked in 2016, and perhaps most outrageously, the state forced all 67 election supervisors to sign non-disclosure agreements before they could receive federal funding for election security, be briefed about vulnerabilities found by cyber experts, or even hook up to the state's voter registration system. What is going on in Florida?
Wow. Yeah.
Right?
This is a huge deal. Think about 2000. Think about what happened there. Think about the laughingstock that Florida was, and imagine how much effort was put into changing that narrative. I mean, we basically spent the last 20 years trying to change the narrative. And then 2018 comes, and that's when we start to hear things. I don't know if you maybe not have noticed that we had a big Senate race that year between Bill Nelson and Rick Scott, who was our governor and now is the senator. And election security was a really big topic there because Bill Nelson's a senator and he starts talking about, hacking and foreign and Russians and then they start saying that he's sort of making things up. He's an old man. He's talking out of school. It was a really big talking discrediting point, and here we are, shortly after that, and it's totally what happened. and nobody talked about it. The governors didn't talk about it. It's really disheartening to know that there's such a threat out there and the lack of transparency over it. It's a sunshine state. We pride ourselves in being an open government state, and unfortunately in certain areas, lots of areas, certain leaders have taken a different tack toward it. This is a talking point. Our Attorney General said earlier this year it was the biggest threat. It was the thing that we had to worry about. And
what is that? They'll hack the what?
Yep, that we were vulnerable. That there was something that they were out to get us, and we had to get this federal money, and we had to sort of lock down. I got to tell you, I've had, for the most part, really good faith and trust in our election supervisors. They're sort of this. We have 67 counties in Florida, so there's 67 election supervisors, but these are mostly nonpartisan, really they're democracy, agents, with some exceptions. You might have seen a few recounts that we had and some bad ballot designs, and we still get some bad press for some things. But these are generally the people who are at the front lines for making sure the vote's going to work right. And so it's been a really complicated process, and this is absolutely a giant test on March 17th, and it'll be interesting to see what happens.
All right, we have to keep an eye on that. Let's shift to the media equation now, Cliff. Let's talk about how people are talking about the media. Okay, I mean, some of you have gone to Trump rallies, Sanders rallies, other rallies. I'm curious if people you're encountering make a distinction between, say, cable news, national news, local news, or is there just a fury out there, or is it different when you actually go up to the people and talk to them? Do they treat you differently? Mika, you want to start?
Yeah, I mean, I can say what we've tried to do in our network is we've hosted various coffee shop sessions with voters to ask them about their news consumption habits and how they feel about the way local media and national media cover topics of interest to them. That said, a lot of people do see media as this conglomerate, and they don't differentiate national media versus their local newspaper or their local TV station, or even some of the more partisan outlets that have been coming to light in recent years. And I think that is a big problem, because when I do come up to people, when I go up to people and say I'm a reporter, they'll ask, what outlet, and then they're surprised if I say I'm based in Wisconsin, and then that kind of opens the door for that conversation to get started. So that is definitely something that's might continue to be an issue, is the way that people are able to kind of, see the differences in media and see it as more than just this entity.
I agree with that. I think when I go to Trump rallies, I'm always struck first off by when I went to the Trump rally in Hershey, there wasn't a single person I approached, and I probably talked to a dozen people, who wouldn't talk to me, wouldn't give me their name, wouldn't tell me why they support the president, what issues they care about. As soon as the rally started, the fake news, booing of the press, the people in the press pen, the kind of group think starts, and it's very different. So obviously one-on-one interactions are different, but I also think that most people don't understand what we do, nor is it their job to, but they do kind of group all media together. And sometimes I'll be talking to someone and I'll be writing down a quote or something, and they'll say, what's your slant on this story? Mm-hmm. And I'll say, why don't you give me your email and I'll send it to you, and why don't you tell me what you think? Because I'm here to quote you accurately and write about the story. And honestly, it's one person at a time, but I think that demystifies the whole process a little bit, to meet a human being who is a reporter, who might even live in your state, and see the finished product of what they write. And So it's not easy, but the more personal interactions, coffee shops, certainly helps.
Amy, you were telling me you have to get the journalists prepared to go to the Trump rallies.
Yeah.
What does
I mean,
that
not the veteran, but when we're sending, when we cover a Trump rally or any political rally, frankly, we're sending a lot of reporters out there, right? There's a few reporters in the event. There's a few reporters outside the event. There's protesters. It's a big scene, and it's a lot going on. So yeah, I mean, not the main political reporters, because they've done this, they understand it. But maybe the education reporter, or the hodgepodge of team that you put together. You're going to want to get them prepared for some maybe aggressive conversation, some confrontational conversation, for the environment within that rally. Because as Julia was just describing, it does take on a whole different viewpoint when you're inside the rally. And for somebody who's just not used to that, it's sort of talking them through what to expect and what to be prepared for.
When Amy told me this on the phone, I'm a longtime former foreign correspondent, and the way she was talking was sort of the way I thought about how you prepare foreign correspondents to go out into the field. It was really scary for me, actually, to hear her talk about it. At the same time, we had a reporter from Vice tweet on Monday, at Bernie Sanders supporters have started booing reporters at rallies. One yelled at us in the pen as he exited in LA yesterday, not at the same level, but starting to feel Trumpian. And Sanders and some top surrogates have been going after, quote, the corporate media with increasing disdain. Emily, have you had any interactions with Bernie supporters or dealing with this?
Yeah, so Bernie has not been to the state in a while. He'll be back Friday, actually. So I look forward to hearing a little bit more about that. But he came in 2018 to Michigan to stump for Abdul El-Sayed, was a gubernatorial candidate we had in the Democratic primary. And I tweeted, it was kind of a big test of Abdul El-Sayed's support. Bernie came there the day before, I think it was, or maybe the weekend before the election. And I was using it as a gauge. I was there to see who showed up, how many people showed up, what the enthusiasm was for Abdul El-Sayed, what the enthusiasm was for Bernie Sanders. And the room was maybe 2/3 full. And I tweeted out a picture of that. And I had Bernie Sanders supporters and Abdul El-Sayed supporters from across this great nation roasting me on Twitter. People were accusing me of photoshopping it. Someone from the great state of California claimed that I had taken the event, the photo hours before the event started, not realizing that there's a time difference between our great states. But yeah, it was, I got hundreds and hundreds of replies, and I had to just mute Twitter. At some point I was like, I've got to write a story off of this. I'm working at this event, I'm doing my job, I can't be dealing with all the vitriol online as well. So, I'm conscious of the fact that, of all things, I was having a little crowd-sized argument with Bernie Sanders supporters, which is, I know, an argument that some of my counterparts in the national media have had with Donald Trump supporters, and sometimes I feel like the sides are closer in their rhetoric than they think they are.
So let's talk about this world of trolling and vitriol towards reporters online. And how do you see social media either as a reporting tool? Why do you tweet? And then what do you recommend also for the young reporters in the audience or how do you deal with people who are attacking you?
It's a massive tool. I mean, it's essential. It's essential to my job. It's essential to anyone up here, to your job, in terms of finding stories, finding people, the reach, the connection. I mean, you can't argue the base value of it in that sense, in terms of reporting. But what that opens you up to, the rest of it, that can be really ugly. And I have watched the bullying of reporters that is horrible. And something my newsroom has had to take an open action toward in terms of a policy, in terms of giving people the steps they can take themselves the steps they need to, involve someone else to take with them in terms of.
So what's the policy? How does it look? What's in a nutshell? What do you do?
In a nutshell, it's you don't need to take this. In a nutshell, it is your job to be on social media. Everybody's job is to be on social media. It's not your job to be bullied or attacked on social media. That's not part of the requirement. And here are some tools for you in terms of muting, in terms of blocking, in terms of understanding the steps you can take that you're allowed to take. I mean, I think some journalists think I'm a journalist. I can't take action against someone because I'm supposed to. It's a free press, right? Everybody should have access to it. But that absolutely doesn't mean that you need to be up for attack. And we need to do a better job of A, standing up for ourselves, and B, giving each other the tools to fight back.
Yeah.
And I will. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Does this work? Oh, okay. And I feel like we don't have a policy, which honestly, I would love to be able to go to someone and say, what should I do in this scenario? But my own way of dealing with it is that if my facts or like integrity are being questioned in a way that is getting a lot of traction, or just period being questioned, and it's not an outrageous claim, then I will engage, and I'll say and I'll come back with whatever the facts are that you need to show that you were right and what you wrote was truthful. But otherwise, I find that sometimes replying just makes it a much bigger, worse, it adds oxygen.
I do want to add that, with the rise of Twitter and social media, most of our audience isn't on that platform. So it kind of turns into this battle of trying to break news through social media, where it's kind of a competition between journalists. And that is, I think, a big issue that's probably going to continue as the media moves into kind of a more digital-first platform. But I agree with Julia in terms of engagement is just, if someone does have a question for me and they're not aggressively attacking me, I always try to engage. And sometimes even if they do, want to say something negatively towards me, engagement always has worked better than just kind of ignoring them, because then, sometimes they're surprised, I didn't expect her to respond, so what do I do now? And it just kind of opens up that door for a conversation between journalist and news consumer.
You sometimes even get apologies.
You do, yeah.
That's true. Mm-hmm. I feel like both of you have mentioned that sometimes it feels like you're winning people over one person at a time, one reader at a time. I feel that way all the time. I'll go to rallies and I guess specifically Trump rallies. I've talked to people who have been hesitant to talk to me at first, and I usually start with something we have in common. Actually my parents are from this area. Where do you live? But I kind of feel like I have left a lot of time with them saying I hate the media, but you're all right, or something like that. And that's a victory for me, but it's also a really ineffective way to go about connecting with people. So I do think that social media has helped kind of expand the number of people I'm able to connect with, and especially people in more remote areas, people in rural areas, I do try to connect with online, because I may only get to their part of the state once a cycle, if that.
So one of the things I've really wanted to do here over the last few years, as Jay and others know, is scale up the kind of interactions that you're talking about. Because as I referenced in the beginning, one of the reasons I believe that the president's attacks on the media have taken hold, not only because of his ardent followers, I don't think they deeply in their souls just want to hate the media. I think it's because there's just fewer local journalists like you doing this kind of work. And a Pew study last year showed only about 2 in 10 Americans say they have ever spoken with or been interviewed by a local journalist. So in that respect, it's a lot easier to demonize reporters if you don't know any. They don't understand the public accountability function that they play. So I've really had this desire to dispatch hundreds of reporters, not the whole country necessarily, starting in places that say flipped, from President Obama to President Trump, places like Jackson, Wisconsin, Calhoun, Michigan, Luzerne, Pennsylvania, St. Lucie, how do you say it? Lucie? Huh? St. Lucie, Florida, and talk to people. What are you reading? Tell me about your day. What's important to you? Oh, suggest a story idea, and do this at scale. And so can you talk about my thesis? Do you think, some of you already mentioned, Mika, that you're doing this.
Yeah.
And I know, Amy, you did a little bit of this. Like, could this work if we could find a funder and, you know, get out there?
I'm so behind this idea.
See?
I utterly believe in it. I mean, I'll just make a point. Like, in the time that I've been covering politics, social media was created and cable news exploded, right? So we have like this 24/7 cycle where people are able to find their talking point and only listen to that talking point. You whatever it is, whatever you believe in, you can shut out everything else and find it. And what we as journalists have to do is find a way to pierce that. And I think the biggest way we do that is get ourselves out there and let people know who we are. You know, PolitiFact coming out of the 2016 election and trying to figure out, you know, what can we do as nonpartisan, independent fact-checking website? What can we do to help build trust in media? We set off on a course to go to the reddest areas in the country where we didn't exist. PolitiFact's a network of across the country in lots of states, California included, but so we tried to go to states, really red states, and spend a week there. So we went to 4 states, and I went to 2 of them. I went to Oklahoma and West Virginia, and we spent a week, and we met with. You know, we held a couple of public events like this one. We held, you know, we did like a happy hour at a brewery. We met with the Republican Club. We met the Democrat Club. We talked to the Rotary. We just hung out around town and like made ourselves visible and did just what you were talking about. Like, you know, talking to people about what they consume and letting them, their news they consume, and letting them understand what we do and understand like decisions we make, and just sort of like, you know, pierce the veil of what looks like a really can't understand how you decide what you know, anything, and let them know we're real people. And I wish we could do that everywhere, because I definitely think it would be such a difference maker.
Tell them the story about the Tulsa World.
So yeah, so Tulsa World is the paper in Tulsa, and you know, we worked with the Tulsa World because they were part of our network in terms of like setting up in town and figuring out where to go and everything. And you know, over the course of this week of these events, I was floored by how many people I met who hated the Tulsa World, and I don't mean disliked, I mean hated. Like, it was vitriol, and I was like unnerved, because I mean, we got plenty of readers who, you know, don't like us, even where I live. Lots of people like us, but some people are like, yeah, the Tampa Bay Times, blah, blah. But this was true hate, and we held this event at a library, and we sort of walked through PolitiFact and the whole places, and a few of the editors from the Tulsa World came to that event, and in the Q&A that happened, some of the questions were about the Tulsa World, and like, why can't they be so, you know, you guys are so independent. And I was just like, oh my gosh, I'm glad you're hearing. I don't know it didn't seem like they were aware of how much disconnect there was with their own community.
So it's useful for the newsrooms too. But everybody really loves Pointer now, right? Or PolitiFact.
Absolutely, it made it was
They never
cool.
probably heard of PolitiFact before that.
We did a study. You know, we did a survey with people we met. We asked everyone who there to fill out a survey, and then we checked back with them like 3 months later to see, because we started fact checking in Oklahoma, we started fact checking in West Virginia, like just so they could see it in their own community, and it wasn't such a distant thing.
Julia, you wanted to jump in?
Well, on a much smaller scale, our politics editor put up a map of Pennsylvania, and obviously Philadelphia is in the far southeastern part of it, and said, you know, I want to go to every single county, and 2 weeks ago, I drove from Philly to Pittsburgh. I've been a reporter at the Philadelphia Inquirer for 8 years. I have never driven from Philly to Pittsburgh over the course of 4 days and talked to people along the way. And yes, both things happened. People who had never, and I checked avoid highways so that I would drive through like areas and stop in different places. But you know, as beneficial as it is, I think, for people in communities to see us out there working, I got more opinions and story ideas and phone numbers of voters who I will be calling back as this process, you know, I'm eager to call some of them already to say, like, what do you think of this Biden momentum? So it really, it's mutually beneficial, and I hope that we continue to do it. And it exists in the city too. We have a really great Metro columnist named Helen Ubinius who does pop-up columns. So she will go to Latino communities that might not have even heard of the Philadelphia Inquirer, and she'll talk to people and write a column based on her conversations there. And I just think that's a really great idea.
Now, I want to add, with our coffee shop sessions, when we're asking people where are they getting their news, sometimes, it really works to kind of go more in depth. And if someone says, oh, I watch MSNBC or I watch Fox, say, oh, who do you like on that? Do you like Rachel Maddow? Do you like Tucker Carlson? And why do you go to them as a trusted source? And some of those people are saying, I don't read my local newspaper. It's like, why, what would it be for us to make you come to us instead of kind of going towards your preferred narrative, in a sense? So I think that's
What do they say?
I think a lot of it is local news is shrinking, so they don't want to read about, Wisconsin as a whole. They want to read about what's happening in their town, and because, that's with the loss of local journalism and shrinking staffs, is they don't see it as impactful to their lives or, really resonate with them when it's just statewide news all the time.
One of you was saying this to me when we chatted earlier about those, because of the cutbacks we talked about, news organizations have to make decisions about what they're going to cover. And what's lost is some of these sort of local, hyper-local events that people really, really feel passionately should be covered. And there's a resentment that builds when you don't cover that parade or that whatever. So again, part of the solution, maybe if there were more reporters out there doing that kind of reporting, could that help?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there's whole communities in our community that we don't cover. Besides the Florida primary, we've got a bunch of local elections. We're going to elect a mayor of the city of Clearwater, and then there's a city called Safety Harbor that's got a contentious mayor's race that we can't even cover. Like, we've got, you've got to make decisions every day, and certainly if there were more. I do think that's part of the battle. It's the making sure people know who we are, but making sure we're where they want us to be.
And I think expanding op-eds, which is not our job. We are reporters, and not everyone understands that distinction. But I've noticed in our newsroom that they're soliciting more essays and op-eds, and kind of like we might be cutting back down on parade coverage, but we're having local voices in other ways, if that makes sense.
Yeah, we've done a lot with trying to bring, sorry, I feel my mic got quick. We've done a lot with trying to bring voices into our coverage that might not have been there 5 or 10 years ago. We did some events with gubernatorial candidates where we took people we'd interviewed about the issues in the race, that were, teachers or business people or people from the community, community advocates, college students, and put them in a room with the candidate and let them ask the questions. And we've had a lot of good luck with sort of bringing people into the process so that they understand, a little bit about how difficult it is to do that, to set up that scenario, to interview someone, to have everything on top of mind exactly when you need to. But also understand that we're really trying to be a conduit for them, and that if we're not covering the issues that they care about and we're not reflecting our community, we're not doing our jobs.
I love that, teaching them that's what I want to do, teach our COM 104 class at scale. There's a lot of questions here, and what's top of mind for me is, and a lot of people in this audience, is disinformation, misinformation. A big topic out here, given where we are here in Silicon Valley, is who is actually responsible for policing this problem that we have online. Is it the journalists? Is it the platforms that should downrate it and things like that? At least 2 of you are working with PolitiFact. So can you talk a little bit about what I'm going to call the burden on journalists that have to spend a lot of time now fact-checking things that are either put out by the Russians or the campaigns, And how effective do you think it is with voters?
Yeah, I think there's accountability to be held for the people who are spreading that, but it's also our role as journalists to seek truth where it is. And so part of that fact-checking, I think, is a natural part of the reporting process. And so I don't see it as a bad thing to try and expand our coverage to include more of that, and debunk these disinformation and misinformation that's spreading the web and beyond. But I do think that it does become a strain sometimes, especially for smaller papers when they're trying to have reporters do so many things at once.
Yeah.
I think it's a big job. PolitiFact, as I mentioned, has a network of fact checkers in states across the country.
Just to back up, so for those who don't know what PolitiFact is, you want to explain its relationship to Poynter? Or,
Sure. PolitiFact is part of the Poynter Institute. It was started at the Tampa Bay Times in our newsroom and took over by the Poynter Institute, which is a school for journalists in St. Petersburg, Florida, owns the Tampa Bay Times. So they took over PolitiFact, which is, as I say, an independent, nonpartisan fact-checking network that really started with the idea of we want to help voters understand the truth in politics and be able to answer the questions they might be wondering about. And for us, that universe does include all the misinformation that you might see. We actually have a partnership with Facebook, as do several other fact checkers, where you can be on your Facebook feed and you could see something, and you can flag it and it'll go into a spreadsheet that we get access to of things that people have flagged as this might be false, and I wonder if it's false. And once we rate it and say we rate it false, the next time you try to share that thing, it'll pop up a flag to you that'll say, hey, this has been debunked by fact checkers. So there has been some, we've been fact checking conspiracy theories since we started. In 2007, when PolitiFact started, I was the one trying to find Barack Obama's birth certificate. So this is not a new
How'd
topic.
that go?
It was such an adventure. I got the one from, not the long form one, but I got the one from Hawaii. Yeah. Anyway, so it's not a new thing. It's just, this is the internet, right? This is social media. This is the thing. And as much work as we do on it, and we do a lot on it, it's a fraction of what's out there. So I do think there is a responsibility for the platforms for the role they take in helping to police it.
So I want to imagine a scenario here where it's October 6th, 2020, and I don't know, who do you want to be the candidate in my scenario? Biden? I don't know. Let's just pretend it's Biden. No offense to the Bernie Sanders supporters, okay? And there's a hack of Joe Biden's chief of staff's emails, and they're posted on, where's he from? In Pennsylvania?
Scranton?
ScrantonLeaks.org.
Scranton.
And they're all there. Okay? What do you think's going to happen? What are you guys going to do? What's the plan?
I'm going to read them and see what's there.
Read them? Yeah.
And then I think it depends what's there, whether it's newsworthy.
Anybody want to offer another idea?
Sounds like you have one.
I have an idea. Obviously, you're going to do that. You're going to go through them, right? But is there a world, or am I only, just dreaming, where someone suddenly says, "Oh my God, who hacked the emails? Why did they hack them? Can we look at the provenance of this? Wow, what's the why of this, as opposed to whatever that chief of staff was cooking?" And
Absolutely.
I mean, do you think that there's a sensitivity to this problem, either in your newsrooms, or do you think this is something that the national media are going to deal with? Or do you think that I'm just curious if it's even coming up as a conversation, or there's just so much going on right now and journalists are scrambling to keep up that you can't really plan for that, what I think is going to be an eventuality,
That specific scenario?
Well, I don't know about his chief of staff, like some kind of hack, some kind of, because look, the FBI says that it's happening, right? Where there are players who are trying, they just said this last week, they're going to try and influence what we see, what we believe to be true. We have political candidates who are deliberately trying to manipulate. Mike Bloomberg, who pulled out, did an obviously manipulated video. But then there are others that are more subtle. So you've got that on the video side. I imagine that there will be material that will pop up that will be meant to harm a candidate. And there's no debate that had a big impact on Hillary Clinton in 2016. So I was just curious whether it's coming up.
Well, I think it's like Well, this may be wishful thinking. On one hand, I think it's like any tip you get. What is the agenda of the person giving it to you? Where are they from? Where did this come from? I think that is absolutely critical. But I think that one thing that does become a challenge is if the Times and the Post and all the nationals start reporting about this, do we on the more local level ignore it? I don't think my editors would let me, even if I didn't know the responsible backstory. And
I think
know
it depends on where it is. I mean, if that's in Florida, if you're talking about, then we're absolutely going at it as hard as we can. And we're not ceding that ground to a national market. But if it's somewhere else,
I didn't mean to imply in Scranton we would.
no, I didn't. I know you did
that up.
But
I
I,
don't
meant
think it's
that.
gonna
I
be
meant
called
that.
Scranton
Like
Leaks,
it's
but,
not.
yeah.
I mean, we're a regional newspaper, and yeah, do we cover a national race? Absolutely. But are we? We cede ground now to the national outlets in terms of those campaigns, right? And so it would depend on the where.
Yeah, so this is just an issue I'm very focused on right now, and I wanted the audience to get a feel for if there's anything alive and well in journalism, it's competition. And it's fervent both between the locals and the nationals, between I know from meetings I just had in DC and New York, but between the majors and BuzzFeed, like everybody's still competing to be first. So I think that's something I want to watch. We have a lot of younger voters here too as well. And in my class, we watched some of the Washington Post TikTok videos. Did anybody see this guy?
Like Cory Booker.
Cory Booker running. Did you guys
So
see it?
funny.
So do you guys know what TikTok, some of you, for TikTok, a really short video. And Cory Booker is running through National Airport in DC. I can't describe him, it's not gonna be as funny. And he knocks the guy over as he's running to catch his flight, and they play this dramatic music in slow motion. And I mean, the Washington Post put this out. Oh my God, this is being taped. It was great. It was outstanding. No, it was so no, my question is, so they're obviously doing this to try and get younger voters, and I'm wondering are you guys playing with TikTok? Because younger voters aren't sitting on Facebook and Twitter, right? Like, so how are you thinking about that? New tools and reaching a more diverse audience?
Yeah, we definitely try to explore those things as they crop up. We did some Snapchat work early on. I understand Snapchat is old now. I'm old now, so I'm not entirely sure.
I'll just jump in for a second. I learned recently Snapchat has twice as many users as Twitter.
Really?
Twice as many.
Who's the guy you said, the show?
And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Oh, no, that's
There
fascinating.
is a Snapchat news show called Good Luck America, and it's hosted by a former CNN reporter. 4 to 6 minute news stories about the election, 6 million viewers per snap. Go on.
I hope that is the unit. It sounds right. But yeah, so I mean, I think we're definitely interested in engaging those younger audiences. And I would also say that YouTube skews a little bit younger, at least in our experience, or at least in my personal observations, in terms of a platform that people can find our stuff on, even if they're not looking for MLive, even if they're not looking for Michigan news. Maybe they're looking for vaping content, and my video of the governor talking about why she wants to ban flavored vapes is on the list. So.
Instagram stories has been a place we've seen tremendous growth in terms of telling news stories and reaching out to audiences. And certainly when we were in South Carolina, that was part of how we were telling the story.
That's interesting. All right, I'm going to go to a question from my friend Felicity here, longtime New York Times reporter. The 2016 results were a surprise in part because national reporters perhaps reported more on polls than people. In 2020, what is likely to be missed nationally that you can already identify as issues locally? And then there's a follow-up here specifically for you, Julia, but is there anything that you're thinking about, whether, in the very local space, maybe that relates, in terms of climate change, labor, very hyper local economic issues or anything?
I mean, this has been written about a little bit, but I think fracking is a good example of a very
That's what she wrote.
Oh, okay.
She knew, yeah.
Of a very hyper local issue that people, as much as people tuned into politics, might vote on ideology and how they identify and the person. Most voters vote about the economy and jobs, and if a candidate is saying they're going to ban fracking, and there's a community of people that rely on fracking, that becomes a big issue. So I think that's a key example in Pennsylvania. And then, how it takes a little more reporting, though, than just the the people that are shouting the loudest about fracking. Like, how many jobs are we actually talking about, and how will these policies actually affect people? But I mean, yeah.
Yeah, for us, I would say water is the biggest theme. In the 2016 election, we saw Hillary Clinton focus in pretty early and pretty often on the Flint water crisis. That is still playing out in that community. There are people who don't trust the government and may never trust the government ever again living in Flint, Michigan, who turn on their taps every day and are afraid to drink that water. And it's a statewide issue too, with emerging contaminants, PFAS and PFOS. I don't know if I'm saying all those right. But are huge in Michigan. We had a big contamination in sort of a wealthy part of the state. Rockford is over a suburb of Grand Rapids. And there was an old tannery there that was using PFAS to treat some of their shoe leather to make it waterproof. It leached into the water supply. We have the Wart Smith Air Force Base in Oscoda that was using PFAS in firefighting foam. It leached into the water supply. There are pockets all across our state, not just in Flint, Michigan, of people who are afraid to drink their water, and they are looking for infrastructure improvements and someone who can fix that.
I would say our issues are really driven by a really strong rural-urban divide, and that's in terms of every issue. So the climate change is a big topic that we've heard voters talk about, surprisingly to me, just because hearing it from people who lean Democratic is one thing, but even Republicans have said that that is an issue that they're concerned about, even in the Midwest with higher lake levels and things like that happening in Wisconsin. But jobs in the economy is going to be huge, and it's not just keeping a momentum with having a strong economy or keeping it as the way it is, but also, is it sustainable for people? Are people making good wages? Do they have job security? Those are all issues that people say that they want to see solved and resolved as the election continues.
But Mika, are people, I don't know if you've drilled down on the climate change thing, but are people in Wisconsin making a connection between Trump pulling out of the Paris Accord and rolling back EPA regulations and, the things that are happening in the climate? Or do they see it as separate universes? Is there a way to ask them about that?
Yeah, I think those who don't necessarily support the president definitely do, but those that might, I think they see climate change as kind of this trigger term. So I think they're concerned about some of the environmental issues, maybe more at a statewide level, but since state politics and national politics often also get conglomerated into one nowadays with how partisan everything is, I think it's just more so blame it on one side or the other, but I think the connection's being made, but they don't want the economic overhaul of emphasizing on climate change so much to get those problems resolved that are happening.
Yeah, you want to, Amy?
I just wanted to say, in Florida, an unexpected bipartisan agreement is over oil drilling and not wanting it. There's hundreds of miles of coastline in the peninsula of Florida, and any candidate, and Trump has been one of them, and you can go back to John McCain and Sarah Palin, and who comes in and wants to open up the waters to oil drilling. That's going to really unite the state.
So issues that the candidates should be thinking about: drilling, fracking, how they're going to deal with it. What is the climate change issue in Wisconsin, just so we know? What's the main one that people are worried about?
I think lake levels, and they're worried about what communities is it really going to impact, which people
So
are
rising water tables.
Yeah.
And then the poisoned water are big
Water,
issues.
infrastructure.
Water. Okay, that's interesting. This is interesting about Fox News watchers tending to be maybe less informed than viewers of no news at all. What solutions are there for this? Should we consider passing a 21st century fairness doctrine, meaning sort of, I think, equal time, Ted, right? Equal time for all the different people. Is that what who has the 21st century fairness doctrine? I think it means to give equal time for the candidates. Like it used to be before Reagan, right? Communication scholars in the audience. I think I'm saying this right. Any thoughts on that? Basically it's a question about, again, going back to the polarized cable news environments, and if there's a way, could you imagine a world where people were we didn't have that? Like, would that improve things, you think?
Sure. I mean, it's funny because when you just said that, I was like, well, yeah, they'll give them equal time, but then the talking heads will just destroy whoever was on. But if you, I think what you're describing is a world where it's not partisan panels on both sides, depending on which channel you turn on. I'd be interested in that. I don't know.
There's a lot of questions here about Facebook's responsibility on ads and erroneous information. Those of you dealing with fact checking and the rest of you, how do you see them out here? Our neighbors. Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to see them in some respects as an honest broker, especially when it's so easy to spread misinformation on Facebook. We had a situation recently where a colleague of mine wrote a story, and I guess when you do a paid advertisement to promote the story, which we weren't doing, but a campaign was doing, you can actually change the headline so that it appears differently on Facebook. And that it was disingenuous as to what the story was about, and it affected an important race that we cover, and made us look like my outlet had some sort of agenda when of course we don't. So I just see like new issues cropping up on Facebook every day. Frankly, I feel like it's a little bit like playing whack-a-mole with disinformation, and I don't know how you can fix that without a platform solution. Not winning people over one person at a time does not work when you're talking about an age of viral information.
Someone asking about why following up on something we discussed a bit earlier, but maybe we didn't answer it adequately, why you think the narrative of fake news has gained so much popularity over the last few years, and does it point to some underlying grievances, perhaps, that are legitimate?
I think it's just become the way to talk about something that you dislike or that you don't care about. It's become the in vogue way to put something down, and instead of that, there's been some dramatic change in our culture and how it's just become part of the lexicon of how people talk and try to put each other down.
I think as politics becomes way more personal nowadays with how polarized everything is, the term fake news is a way to just combat something that doesn't align with your values or the things that you agree with, because oftentimes I feel like voters today see things that don't cover their candidate or party favorably as an attack on themselves. So, it's a trigger term for a lot of people, and I don't know how much that weighs into their trust of the media, but it's definitely a way to kind of defend what they see as, reporting that kind of hurts where they're coming from.
Have there been any local officials in the communities you're covering who are emulating this and using it to attack media, or do you feel like it's been mostly just from the president?
We've had some in some really small communities. I mean, we've got a 4-county area, and one of our counties is super rural. And it's definitely in the, on the school board or the county commission, it's something that comes up in terms of the coverage.
Yeah. We've had a sort of mixed response, and we have this line that I think Republicans in Michigan have been walking of, when asked about this, saying well, the Michigan media is all right, but we know that there are problems elsewhere. So, and frankly, that may be true, but I think that politicians kind of try to dance that line of not offending the people who are covering them every day, but still bashing and more, I guess, ambiguous, the media, perhaps your least favorite words.
My least favorite word. One of the people in the audience wants us to drill down a little bit on urban areas. And urban Milwaukee was mentioned. Is urban Milwaukee notably better or worse off than it was in 2016? What about Philly or Lansing or Tampa? Is there any metric for that?
I mean, I can't speak to Milwaukee-specific issues necessarily on whether the city is prospering more than it was in 2016, but I can say, there's a lot more emphasis to hit that area in terms of grassroots volunteerism and voter outreach on both sides. We're seeing, Democrats sending out people to go into communities that weren't hit until a few days before the election, early on, to drive that turnout and get them to the polls.
Well, and Mika mentioned this earlier, but I mean, Philadelphia is we have made some small strides in the past 4 years, but we are still the biggest, we have the highest poverty percentage of the big cities. And that's not something that changes in 4 years and 8 years. I mean, it's just been a continuous problem. And Trump's campaign is going into blue areas like Philadelphia and having these Black Voices for Trump events. And they're going to set up actual like community centers that are Black Voices for Trump community centers. And again, Pennsylvania was won by such small margins that the gut reaction for me is like, well, how many African-American voters are going to join the Trump bandwagon? But he doesn't need that many. And so this idea that, you know, you're not that much better off, the cities are not doing much better, give me a try, which he did in 2016. I think he's doing again, but with more resources this time.
So what do you have to lose?
Right,
Yeah.
that's what he said, yeah.
We spent a fair amount of time mocking the cable news dais of predictions, but somebody wants a prediction here. So let's pretend we're on CNN at 9 o'clock. Okay. In each of your respective states, do you feel like there is currently a front runner to win the Democratic nomination? And what do you think the big factors are in the coming days or weeks that may change this?
I'll start. I'm not sure there definitely is no front. I mean, Biden's been the establishment pick. We've done, you know, from our reporting, that's been the one that people expect. But again, you know, nobody's really campaigned there. Nothing's really, you know, I think it's a toss-up. Who's going to win that state? I don't think Elizabeth Warren has much of a profile in our state at all. So I don't think it will be her. But you know, just playing that out a little farther. I mean, it's gonna depend on who it is if they're gonna beat Trump, because it's gonna be very easy for Trump to win the state of Florida again. Super easy.
It's going to be easy for him to win it again?
Yep.
You're calling it?
I don't think it depends. If Bernie Sanders is the nominee, it's no question, it's a Trump state. I think.
Did y'all hear that?
I think Bernie Sanders has done a disservice to his support in the Democratic stronghold of South Florida with some of the comments he's made recently about Fidel Castro and more broadly about socialism. There's an obstacle there in terms of support. Joe Biden, though, you know, he's got a history in Florida. He's got a connection to Florida. He's connected to the establishment. Maybe he makes a run for it. I don't know.
I think I would narrowly give it to Biden in Pennsylvania in the primary because of his roots, because of his momentum. But I will say, I just did a story before the last 72 hours about a network of progressive groups that have popped up in red parts of Pennsylvania, started by Sanders supporters in 2016, who then got involved in politics, won their own local races, very much like grew progressive movements in unlikely places, Lancaster, Pennsylvania, Amish country. And it's, you know, part of me looks at this kind of network of mini movements around the state and says, you know, there could be momentum for him if Joe's momentum slows. But I would narrowly give it to Biden, and I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if I want to make a call in the general. Do I have to?
No, you don't have to.
Maybe Biden too. I don't know.
Mika.
Yeah, I gotta say it's a toss-up here too. I guess it depends how the DNC is gonna go and what impact that's gonna have on people in July. But I'm seeing both sides really aggressively go into the other's territory. So it's gonna be interesting how that plays out and if that works out for them in order
You mean like
to.
Biden people going into, you talking about the Democrats or you talking about the...
I'm talking narrowly, like Democrats going into Trump's rural base and Trump going into urban.
What about
or-
Biden versus Sanders in Wisconsin?
So yeah, I mean, I think if it's Sanders, I think that there's going to be a really strong youth turnout. There's a lot of people who don't want the status quo again that Biden would offer. And with Trump being so extreme, it'd be better off to have someone maybe who is a little bit more, you know, left to counter Trump's. So.
I'll give Michigan to Bernie Sanders, so you guys can all think about how wrong I am a week from today. But I will say that Bernie Sanders won Michigan once. He shocked the moderate and pragmatic Democratic establishment in our state in 2016. I think that he has the capacity to do that again in 2018. When I was talking about the expansion that we've seen, one huge demographic that's going to open up the vote to is college students who previously walked this dance between, am I going to vote here? Am I going to vote absentee at home? Will I get the ballot back in time? They can walk in the same day, get registered and vote. I mean, that is a really powerful force, I think, and that young demographic is just so invested, I think, in a Bernie Sanders candidacy.
So all the Ann Arbor people are going to vote in Michigan instead of like mailing their absentee to New York, you mean? Or is that what you're saying?
I mean, they could. I mean, there are still residency requirements, obviously. So, but even just people who are in-state students who maybe don't make it the 2-hour drive to Traverse City area to vote if they need to, and maybe don't understand how the clerk process works or the absentee process works, or aren't up there frequently enough to request it, who are going to be able to, one of their friends says, hey, I'm going to the polls today, you want to come? They can come with them.
So I just have one final question that's sort of, I'm sorry if I didn't get to your question, but a bunch of these sort of touch on sort of the important role that political journalists play covering the election and shaping the narratives, and whether or not there's a way, what's the responsibility of journalists to shape the narrative for the public versus sort of, reporting the issues, really sort of like issues reporting versus like trends. And, imagine a world where there was just no horse race reporting and it was very pure and all about each of the candidates on the issues. It's hard. It won't happen. So maybe we don't want to waste time on that. But, talk about how you see your role in sort of shaping the narrative of this election.
Yeah, I mean, I personally try to pull myself out of the horse race as much as possible, and I see my colleagues doing that too. We've had kind of a concerted effort to do that and say, sit down in a meeting at the beginning of a cycle and say, here's what we're hearing about. Here's 3 issues that we want to make sure that the candidates are addressing because it's what we're hearing about from people that we cover, and sort of go forward with that intentionality. That said, it is super easy to get dragged in directions that you never saw coming. And I think that's half of my days or weeks sometimes. And I think that we have to be careful about being responsive to our audience and our readers, and covering the issues that we know matter to them, and not necessarily what might be hot or what a campaign might be pushing or what we can get exclusivity to. I see that a lot, people using embargoed information or exclusive information to get coverage of something that we wouldn't cover otherwise. And I think that as a group, the media is susceptible to things like that, and that we need to be conscious about setting some of that aside when we can.
Yeah, I mean, I would say we've also really driven away from trying to cover the horse race. We've driven away from writing about endorsements and polls all the time and trying to analyze things. I think most readers really just want information that's going to help them make their decision at the poll. So that could be looking at a candidate's voting record, or where they stand on issues, just basic information, but also making yourself present in the community and getting to know what it is that they want to see covered.
And I think in terms of reporting on voters, it's really, I try to take specific, responsible bites out of the electorate to talk to, you have to talk to so many people to do this well. But, I think if you're trying to reveal something about what a voting bloc, you have to include the extreme nuance that there is within the black vote, or whatever you're writing about. And so I've sort of tried to do that and to do it well. And then you can really tell some interesting stories because you kind of dial in on something that isn't revealed in poll numbers or whatever it might be.
I take this really seriously. I think, I think we've been willing to cede the horse race, the everything to the national media, and to think of our job, as each of these women has described, as sort of introducing the candidates to our readers, and trying to do that through the most responsible way we can. So like in each case, we've sort of taken like what's the most important issue that they have, and can we explain who they are, and the issue at the same time. So like we did a big explainer on Medicare for all and helped understand, you know, Bernie Sanders and that conversation. And, you know, we went down to West Palm Beach and found a mayor who had of the same size city as Pete Buttigieg in South Bend and told the story of his campaign through the eyes of a mayor of a town the same size so that you could understand his experience and what he was ready for. And frankly, this mayor was like, are you kidding? I couldn't run the country. So we've tried to...
I bet Mayor Pete loved that story.
They actually did love that story. It was shocking to me. But so I guess what I'm trying to say is we've tried to zig and zag a little bit to give distinct coverage of this election that educates our readers at the same time about the issues and about the candidates. And, you know, because we're not, you know, we've got one, you know, we got fewer resources than we have for any other election that we've covered. And so we've just had to make smarter choices about how we do it.
So we have a lot of academics, activists, journalists, student journalists, concerned citizens in the audience who came out, I think, because perhaps they're worried about our information ecosystem, our toxic political climate. And my goal tonight in putting this together was not only to shed light on what's happening in these pivotal states regarding these problems, but to give us some food for thought on what we can do here at Stanford and this community. And I definitely think I have some new ideas. And an idea I think for everybody is support local journalism. And make sure you follow these wonderful reporters and subscribe. And thank you all for coming tonight. Good job, guys.